Onto your headphones and pour your favorite beverage. It's time for the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast. Now, fresh off the sidelines, your host, Matt McPeak.
Fantasy freaks and geeks, what's up? This is the AFC 2020 draft preview episode. We're going to look at all 16 AFC teams' draft situations, see what pick they have, how many picks they have, where they're picking, what the teams need, what I think their top 2 or 3 needs are. I must have looked at 100 different mock drafts over the past week or so. A couple teams stick out for sure as far as their draft capital and whatnot. Right now, most of the teams have 7 or 8 picks, but there are 7 teams with 10-plus picks, and 4 of them are in the AFC. So we're going to get into those. As far as the team needs that you're going to hear for each team going through this, I took them from the NFL Network. They're the place I trust the most. It's the place I've been looking to for the longest. So if you hear team needs on this episode, that's where they're coming from. Let's dive into the first team, the team that has been setting themselves up for this draft for all of last season, and that's the Miami Dolphins. They have 3 first-round picks, 14 picks total. They pick 5th, 18th, which they got from Pittsburgh from Fitzpatrick, and 26th, which they got from Houston for Laramie Tunsil. Everyone seems pretty convinced that they will use their first pick on either Tua Tagovailoa or Justin Herbert. The question is really, what does Miami do with their other 2 first-round picks? They also have 2 second-round picks, and when you add in their third-round pick, Miami has 6 picks in the first 70 overall. So, if they can hit on even just 4 of those, even just 3 of those 6, they're looking pretty good right now as far as how they've set themselves up. They need to hit a bunch of homers here. Depending on how their first 2 selections go, I wouldn't be surprised if the Dolphins try and use one of their second-round picks to move their third round or their third overall selection, which is 26, which they got from Houston. Try and move that up if there's a player that they think is going to be somewhere in the early 20s that they really want. I would not be surprised if they took one of those second-rounders, packaged it with 26th overall to try and move up. Again, according to NFL Network, their team needs quarterback, which I think a lot of people would agree with, tackle after they lost Laramie Tunsil, running back, safety, and they need an edge rusher. So Miami's offensive line graded as as the worst in the league last year with 5 of the 7 tackles, pretty much everyone's first-round mock draft. I assume Miami will take one of those 5 to 7 first-round graded tackles. Their lead rusher was Ryan Fitzpatrick with 243 yards. So think about that for a minute. Their leading rusher on the season had 243 yards, and it was their 30-something-year-old quarterback. So they are definitely hurting in the run game. They already added Jordan Howard in free agency, but you got to figure they're going to eye up a running back somewhere in those first 3 rounds, somebody that a young kid that they can run into the ground over the next 5 years, which seems to be the trend in the NFL. And again, safety, after they lost Minkah Fitzpatrick, it only makes sense for them to go out and get another safety, although they, if you go back and listen to the free agency episode, they did some crazy things in free agency. They pretty much brought on an entirely new offense. They have the chance to have one of the best tandems of cornerbacks this year. So things are looking up for the Miami Dolphins for sure. The next team is the New York Football Jets. This will be the Jets' GM Joe Douglas's first draft with the Jets. He spent the past 5 years with the Bears or the Eagles, but his first 15 years in the NFL were spent with the Ravens and Ozzie Newsome, who, in my opinion, has been the best GM in football this millennium. So as a Jets fan, I'm excited to have someone who seems like they know what the hell they're doing there in charge on draft day. Guys in the past 4 or 5 years like Idzik and it's just they've been horrible. So I'm excited to have somebody who has a pedigree and who has the resume that says he knows what he's doing here. So team needs wide receiver, edge rusher, tackle, corner, running back. They have 8 picks total with an extra 3rd-round pick that they got from the Giants for Leonard Williams and an extra 6th-round pick they got in 2019 from the Chiefs for Darren Lee, who was a former first-round linebacker. The Jets they haven't really had a good pass rush since Rex Ryan was fired back in 2014. Their top 2 threats at wide receiver right now are Jamison Crowder and Bashad Perriman. A lot of mocks that I've seen have the first wide receiver coming off the board going to the Jets somewhere in between 11 and 14. A lot of people have that first wide receiver going, so the Jets could possibly have their pick from the litter of the consensus top 4 wide receiver prospects in CeeDee Lamb from Oklahoma, Jerry Jeudy, and Henry Ruggs III from Alabama, and then Justin Jefferson from LSU. The Jets have had pretty good luck with first-round wide receivers in their history. I actually went back looking from Al Toon to Keyshawn Johnson and Santana Moss, so hopefully they can keep that up. The Jets did sign 5 offensive linemen in free agency, but 4 of them were interior linemen with George Fant, the only tackle of the 5 signees. So they could also get a tackle in the first round and wait until early second to get their or mid second, I guess, to get their wide receiver. But with so many big boards having as many as 9 wide receivers in the top 50, I think I think the Jets are also in a pretty good spot to get 2 of the big positions that they really need, which is a tackle and a wide receiver. So as a Jets fan, I'm excited. Looking at the Buffalo Bills, one of 6 teams without a first-round pick this year. Buffalo has 7 total picks. They had 10 picks in this year's draft after acquiring a 5th and a 6th-rounder from Cleveland for offensive lineman Wyatt Teller last year, but they traded away their 1st, 5th, and 6th-rounders to Minnesota to get wide receiver Stephon Diggs, which may prove to have been a little hefty price after looking at what Arizona gave up for DeAndre Hopkins. But either way, the Bills are now set with a legit receiving core. Their biggest needs, edge rusher, cornerback, possibly another running back, and an offensive lineman. You can never have too many offensive linemen. Luckily for the Bills, they just need to get younger, really. They signed edge rushers Mario Addison to go with Jerry Hughes, but they're both over 30 years old, as are the newly signed corners, Josh Norman and E.J. Gaines. Unfortunately, when you have a cornerback as good as Tre'Davious White, and again, as a Jets fan, I watched this for years with Darrelle Revis, teams are just going to pick on the corner on the other side. So when you have a shutdown corner like Trey White, you need to have a legit number 2 cornerback, so that way your team just doesn't get picked apart all day long. So I wouldn't be surprised if they go DB with their first day draft pick, with the second round pick, since they don't have a first. If Frank Gore really is done playing football, which I won't believe until kickoff of week 1, then they probably will need another running back that fits that traditional goal line back like Frank Gore did. But then again, with so many short yardage and goal line carries going to Josh Allen, maybe they don't really need to go get a complimentary back for Devin Singletary. He finished the season really strong. He was getting a lot of work towards the end of the season, so maybe they look at him as somebody that can take that workload in games when they need him to. All right, the New England Patriots, last but not least, in the AFC East. The Patriots have 12 picks this year. They are going to need every one of them to fill all the holes that they have on defense after they were demolished by free agency. They lost 6 defenders total, 2 starting offensive linemen, and obviously Tom Brady. The majority of their picks are in the last 2 rounds, with 5 picks after the 200th overall pick. So Belichick's going to have to really do work this draft. Their team needs tight end, quarterback, linebacker, defensive lineman, and a wide receiver. Apparently, they are content with fourth-round pick from last year, Jarrett Stidham, starting at quarterback this year. But with 12 picks, I wouldn't be surprised if Belichick added another quarterback towards the end of the draft to compete with Stidham for that QB job. They showed zero interest in signing Cam Newton or Jameis Winston or trading for Andy Dalton. So Stidham may very well be the guy Belichick has in mind to take over, or Belichick's just playing the slow game and waiting until after the draft to get Andy Dalton for probably less than what they can get him for right now. Among the many positions that they need to fill as a result of free agency, linebacker is definitely a spot that they will focus on. Ever since his time with the Giants, Belichick has always had good linebackers, so I expect them to fill that need early. The Patriots tried to make it work with Antonio Brown, but after the debacle that was Antonio Brown, the only legit pass catcher threat on the team last year was Julian Edelman. They used a first-round pick on wide receiver N'Keal Harry, who's really more of a tight end. I don't know if he's really going to end up being a legitimate outside threat, but it was the first time that the Patriots drafted a wide receiver in the first round since 1996 when they drafted Terry Glenn 7th overall. But I assume they will look to at least one more wide receiver in this year's draft. Last season, tight end was a complete non-factor for the Patriots with Matt LaCosse and Ben Watson totaling over just over 300 combined receiving yards and one touchdown between the two of them. So they definitely are going to want to renew that position. All right, AFC North, Cincinnati Bengals team picking first, and it seems like fate to have Joe Burrow available to them. This quarterback, Ohio native, rated as the best quarterback in the draft, and some rate him as the best player in the draft. Some say he's the best quarterback prospect since Andrew Luck. It just makes too much sense for the Bengals to take him first overall and really hit the reset button, if you will. Although the decade of mediocrity from the Bengals has not all been Andy Dalton's fault. Cincinnati has all 7 of their picks at the top of each round. Their team needs quarterback, offensive lineman, linebacker, tight end, wide receiver. The Bengals O-line was in the bottom last year as far as efficiency for an O-line goes. So once they do get their new quarterback, I expect them to look at that position group next. They lost Nick Vigil in free agency, so I think they'll look to add another linebacker, probably one of the faster linebackers available, considering they're going to need someone to attempt to spy Lamar Jackson for the next 8 to 10 years, hopefully. Tyler Eifert moving on from Cincinnati this offseason, so now they're left with just CJ Uzomah as a legit threat at tight end, but head coach Zach Taylor comes from Sean McVay's system of heavy 11 personnel, which means 1 running back, 1 tight end, 3 wide receivers. The Bengals tight ends had a 17% target share compared to the 15% that the Rams tight ends saw in Sean McVay's first 2 seasons with LA. So, obviously which Taylor was in LA. So, I'm not really sure if they feel the need to get another tight end. If they wanted another receiving threat at tight end, I think they would have just re-signed Tyler Eifert. So as far as wide receiver goes, they might want to take one simply because of A.J. Green's age. But I think the Bengals have one of the more underrated wide receiver trios in football if all 3 of them can stay healthy. John Ross is an absolute speed guy and showed a few times last year that he has some legit speed and he can get downfield. Tyler Boyd showed numerous times that he's proven that he can be a legit slot receiver, and we all know what AJ Green can do when he's healthy. So, but if I was the Bengals, I would continue to try and improve the defense and make sure I come out of this draft with an offensive line as a whole that I'm confident in, and nothing can ruin a promising rookie quarterback like a piss-poor offensive line, which we've seen time and time again what teams do. They go out and they get a quarterback in the first round, and then they just completely ignore the offensive line, and the next season the kid just gets beat to hell. So hopefully that doesn't happen here. Looking at the Baltimore Ravens, 9 picks total in this draft with 5 picks in the first 3 rounds. The Ravens killed it in the last 2 drafts, getting starters like Mark Andrews, Hayden Hurst, Lamar Jackson, Orlando Brown, Marquise Brown. Miles Boykin, Jalen Ferguson, Justin Hill. So I'm excited to see what the Ravens can do to get even better. They could use a linebacker, another offensive lineman, another wide receiver, an edge rusher, and just defensive line as a whole. This is now 2 years in a row that the Jets have signed away the Ravens' inside linebacker, with C.J. Mosley leaving last year and Patrick Onwuasor this year. So I expect the Ravens to go after an inside linebacker early, especially after the Ravens had such a hard time stopping the run last year for the first time in what seems like forever for that franchise. Probably why they put a lot of resources towards the defensive line so far this offseason in free agency. They traded for Calais Campbell. They signed Derek Wolfe and Jaheed Ward. They used the franchise tag on Matt Judon. Judon was a great player last year and well-deserving of the tag, but I don't think the addition of Calais Campbell is enough, so I'm looking to see what they address as far as the pass rush goes in the draft. The Ravens also lost longtime starting right guard Marshall Yanda, and with the way the Ravens used their interior linemen last year, you better believe that they're looking for a solid guard to fill that spot. For the majority of last season, the Ravens didn't really need any other receiving options besides Hollywood Brown and Mark Andrews until they played the Titans and fell behind 28-6 going into the fourth quarter. They were forced to completely abandon the run and make Lamar Jackson throw 59 times that game. I think as a result, they could be looking to add another weapon in the passing game at some point in this draft to, kind of balance out that offense a little bit. The Cleveland Browns, they have 7 picks to try and put themselves over the top. They have the 10 spot, despite having a former first overall pick at QB in Baker Mayfield and possibly the best pair of wide receivers in the league. They have one of the most talented groups of skill position players, and if they could put everything together, I don't see why they can't be a playoff team, but they could definitely use some help on the offensive line, safety, linebacker, defensive line, wide receiver. They signed left tackle Jack Conklin, but they still need another tackle. Their offensive line was definitely a problem last year. Only 6 quarterbacks were sacked more than Baker Mayfield. Both of the Browns' projected starting safeties are on 1-year deals, so I'm guessing they're going to look to draft a young safety as well after they traded away Jabril Peppers last year in order to get Odell Beckham. And they lost Joe Schubert and Christian Kirksey, so they did sign P.J. Goodson, but still have a hole at linebacker, so that's another spot that I'm sure they're going to look at in the draft. Looking at the Steelers, they only have 6 picks in this year's draft after they traded the first rounder for Minkah Fitzpatrick, so their first pick isn't until 49 overall. They could also use some more help on the offensive line, the defensive line, especially at edge rusher, and then quarterback and cornerback. Last year, the Steelers got a glimpse of what life without Big Ben and Big Ben looks like, and I don't think Mike Tomlin is sold on either Mason Rudolph or Duck Hodges. Still, they were one of the better teams in the league, but they are another team that has a lot of older players. 4 of the 5 projected offensive linemen starters are 30 years or older. Their best interior defensive lineman, Cam Hayward, is on the other side of 30 as well. The Steelers also have only 1 cornerback currently on the roster that's under the age of 26. With Bud Dupree playing under the franchise tag this year, you got to figure they're going to let him walk in free agency next year and give the big pass rusher contract to TJ Watt. So the Steelers have a lot of spots that they need to get younger at, and only 6 picks to do it. So they're going to need to hit on almost every one of them this year to be successful, or they're just going to have to get a lot of contribution from all these old guys. All right, AFC South, Jacksonville Jaguars. They have a total of 12 picks this year. With 2 of them in the first round. They seem to be sold on Gardner Minshew as their starting quarterback after they traded Nick Foles for a 4th-round pick, but they also made a bunch of other trades, leaving the defense with a lot of holes. It started up the middle last season when they traded away, or it started in the middle of last season, Jalen Ramsey for a first-rounder. Then they traded away Calais Campbell and A.J. Boye, probably their 2 of their better defensive players. Their best defensive lineman, newly franchise tagged Yannick Njoku, has been outspoken about not wanting to play there, not wanting to sign long-term. So this draft, I think they focus on restocking the defense and really turning the page there. It was such a huge part of their success a few long years ago when they made it to the AFC Championship game with Blake Bortles. So along those lines, they could use another corner, defensive line, especially edge rusher, and again, offensive line. They already signed 2 free agent defensive tackles, 2 linebackers, and 2 corners. But I think they still need more. They were tied for 7th with 2 other teams in sacks last year, but 30% of those team sacks were from Calais Campbell and Yannick Njoku. So you got to figure those aren't going to be there, especially next season. So their offensive line was not all that great last year either, despite having both of their tackles being drafted 34th overall and 35th overall in their respective drafts. So they've used a lot of high draft picks on these tackles, and they're just not playing that well. So they have to protect their second-year quarterback to see if he really does have what it takes to play in this league, and they should really get themselves another pass rusher to pair with 2019's first-round pick Josh Allen. Have a legit pair of edge rushers for the next 4 or 5 years. Always a good idea. All right, then we're on to the Tennessee Titans. They have 7 picks. No 4th rounder, no 6th rounders, but they do have 3 7th-round picks. The Titans clearly want to build on what they did last year. They gave Derrick Henry the franchise tag. They signed Ryan Tannehill to a 4-year deal. They finally found a number 1 wide receiver in A.J. Brown after years of spending 1st, 2nd, and 3rd-round picks on guys like Kenny Britt, Damian Williams, Kendall Wright, Justin Hunter, Dorial Green-Beckham, Corey Davis, Taywan Taylor. The list goes on and on. Jonnu Smith looks like he's in line to take over as the top wide receiver now that Delaney Walker retired this offseason, but the defense was not as good last year as they had been the prior years, for a couple years prior to that. They traded away Jarrell Casey to Denver for a 7th-round pick, and so they'll need somebody to fill the middle of the defense. And they have yet to re-sign cornerback Logan Ryan, who was a big part of that defense. He says he won't play for anything less than $10 million a year. Team needs edge rusher, defensive line, offensive line, cornerback, running back. If they're going to have a team that runs the ball and plays defense, they need another pass rusher. Last season, they were ranked in the middle of the league in sacks. Also, relying on your run game so much, they're probably going to want another offensive lineman. If they don't come to terms with Logan Ryan, I would assume that they draft his replacement, and they must get another running back. Dion Lewis walked in free agency, and with Derrick Henry on the tag, this could easily be his last season in Tennessee. Plus, there's no way that they push Derrick Henry as hard throughout the regular season in 2020 as they did last year. Over 300 carries last season in 16 games, over 400 total touches when you add in his receptions and his playoff workload. They need another running back that can spell him in the first half of the season, someone that can maybe take some of the third down work, maybe a good pass blocking running back that they can get kind of late. Looking at the Indianapolis Colts, the Colts are among a few of the teams. I think it's 5 or 6 teams with no first-round pick, but they do have 2 second-rounders, one of them being the 34th overall pick, so very early in the second round. They acquired that last year when they traded their 2019 first-round pick for a pair of second-round picks. They traded away their first-rounder from this year to get defensive lineman DeForest Buckner. I think the 13th overall pick and the $21 million a year for 4 years is a hefty price, but they must have felt like he was a piece that they needed and couldn't get in this year's draft, at least not where they were in the middle of the first round. Team needs 100%. They need a wide receiver, another quarterback, tight end, defensive back, defensive line. I think their biggest hole for a few years now has been a second wide receiver to help T.Y. Hilton. The Colts were in the perfect spot to be able to get one of those big 4 wide receivers in the draft, but they must have felt like they can get one at 34th overall, which would explain the trade for Buckner. Unless they think Jacoby Brissett can learn enough to start in 2020 from backing up Phillip Rivers this year, then I'm going to assume that they're going to want to draft another quarterback. So maybe we see them use both of their second-round picks on a wide receiver and a quarterback. Rivers loves throwing to tight ends, so maybe they go after a secondary tight end to pair with Jack Doyle. Last but not least, in the AFC South, we got the Houston Texans. The last of the AFC teams with no first-round pick. They traded it away for Laramie Tunsil. They do still have 7 picks, but 3 of them are in the 7th round, so their early picks are really going to matter. They traded away DeAndre Hopkins, which I've talked about a lot in the last few episodes, but they recently traded for Brandon Cooks, which puts him on his fourth team in 5 years. The Texans' wide receiving core is puzzling with Will Fuller, Kenny Stills, and now Brandon Cooks, three guys that seem to do best running those deep routes. Then randomly Randall Cobb, who was also signed this offseason. So I don't know what their plan is on offense. Maybe they're going to bring back the old Houston run and shoot from the Oiler days, and maybe they saw the XFL's Houston team having so much success with it. But whatever they end up doing, I'm sure they're just going to ask Deshaun Watson to run around and extend plays like he has been for the past couple of years, and just bomb the ball. I guess that's the new plan here on offense. But it's going to be interesting to see what they're going to do with all these wide receivers. Their team needs defensive line, offensive line, edge rusher. A lot of teams have all the same wide receiver and corner. So they lost DJ Reader, but they signed Timmy Jernigan, and they brought in 5 defensive backs. So I think their focus, at least on defense in this draft, will have to be on edge rusher. J.J. Watt and Whitney Merciless are a good pair, but they need to get younger there. They were lucky to get 8 games out of J.J. last year with all the injuries that he's had over the years. Another pass rusher would definitely do them good. All right, we're going to go a little over here, but we got to get through the AFC West, starting with the Denver Broncos. 10 picks for the Broncos with 3 third-round picks, 5 picks in the top 100 overall. The Broncos and the Raiders, which we'll get into next, are the only teams besides the Dolphins that have 5 picks inside the top 100. So you're going to hear those 3 teams a lot in the first 3 rounds. So we're going to see this AFC West get a serious injection of youth this year. Bronco needs wide receiver, offensive line, cornerback, linebacker, safety. They desperately need another wide receiver on the other side of Cortland Sutton. I think Sutton can be a beast if he's not being triple covered every play. Noah Fant staying healthy will definitely help to do that, but certainly another wide receiver for second-year quarterback Drew Lock would be a good thing. They're obviously they're going to roll with him. They let go of Joe Flacco. It seems like it's Drew Lock's team. So the Broncos added Melvin Gordon and Graham Glasgow in free agency to get more out of the running game, but they still have a hole on the offensive line with Connor McGovern leaving for the Jets and Ron Leary still on the market. I think we see the Broncos use their early picks on the offensive holes and then just spend the rest of the draft loading up on defensive players. 10 picks and 5 in the first 100. They are set. I think they're gonna make some noise. The Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders only have 7 picks this year, but 2 of them are in the first round and 3 are in the third. So they definitely have some serious draft capital. They've added 2 players to each level of the defense in free agency and brought in 2 veterans to catch passes in Nelson Aguilar and Jason Witten. They will open their new stadium this fall, and Vegas will now have its second professional sports team, which a lot of people probably even 5 years ago would have said, no way. Their team needs wide receiver, cornerback, defensive line, offensive line, linebacker. Another team that was bitten by the Antonio Brown experiment. They need a wide receiver, number 1 wide receiver. Terrell Williams and Hunter Renfrow are both really good complements at wide receiver, but they need that alpha number 1 guy that demands the attention to make the jobs of those 2 wide receivers and that crew of tight ends that they're going to have this season. It seems like they hit on both of their DNs in the draft last year with Clinton Farrell and Max Crosby, but besides them, this defense has no impact players on it. I think the Raiders go get their wide receiver and an offensive lineman, and then they load up on some corners and maybe a defensive tackle. Looking at the Chargers have all 7 of their picks this year. With the departure of Phillip Rivers, this is a huge question mark as to whether or not the Chargers are in the game for a quarterback this year, or if they really are okay with going into 2020 with Tyrod Taylor as their starter. They decided to pay Austin Eckler instead of Melvin Gordon, so he is now clearly in the RB1 discussion. They signed Ryan Bulaga away from the Packers, giving them a legit right tackle. But they traded away their left tackle for a guard, so they will have to address left tackle in this year's draft. Their quarterback, offensive tackle, linebacker, edge rusher, and tight end among their team needs. The Chargers signed Nick Vigil, but they lost Thomas Davis and 2 other inside linebackers, and both Joey Bosa and Melvin Ingram will be free agents next year. So I'm guessing that they are going to try and get some youth at pass rusher and linebacker. I can't wait to see what this secondary looks like with all the guys that they've brought in, and hopefully they can stay healthy. And last but not least, the Kansas City Chiefs. Only 5 picks this year, but surprisingly not as many holes to fill as most defending Super Bowl championship teams generally have after taking home the chip. They lost Kendall Fuller to the Redskins, Manuel Ogbah to the Dolphins, Reggie Ragland went to the Lions, and one of their guards, Steven Wisnowski, went to the Steelers. But besides those 4 positions, it's very much the same team from last year. They need another corner, a linebacker. They could use another running back, offensive line and defensive line. You can always add. Finding another solid cornerback to me is number 1 for the Chiefs. With how many points that they put up on offense, they need to be able to keep every game from becoming a shootout. The Chiefs need to bolster the run defense, as we saw what the Colts did last year. Teams want to run the ball against the Chiefs and keep Mahomes on the sideline. Their run defense made huge improvements from 2018, but the loss of Reggie Ragland hurts for sure. So after cornerback, I think linebacker is the next place to focus. I agree that the Chiefs need another running back, but one of the more underrated signings this offseason, I think, was DeAndre Washington to the Chiefs. I think he's going to fit in really well there and catch a decent amount of passes. So I don't know if they go running back in this draft, but they definitely need to keep it in mind with Damian Williams getting that tender this offseason. Last year, we also saw Mahomes get hurt a couple times, so I think Andy Reid is smart enough to know that they need to keep that offensive line stocked with talent, because keeping Mahomes clean, keeping him clean alone should probably get them 7 or 8 wins no matter what. So that's going to do it for the AFC Draft Preview episode of the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate it. Make sure you check us out next week. We'll go through all the NFC teams just like we did here today. And as always, may the fantasy gods be cruel to your opponents.
You have been listening to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. For more great episodes and information, follow us on social media and tune in every week. Kickin' or Stickin' is available on Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Alexa, Reach.tv, or your favorite podcast service. Kickin' or Stickin' is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. To find out more about this and other great shows on our network, visit us online at hcuniversalnetwork.com today. Fantasy football is fun, but gambling addiction destroys lives. If you or someone you love suffers from gambling addiction, please do not be afraid to seek help. The National Council on Problem Gambling operates the National Problem Gambling Helpline Network. Contact them today at 1-800-522-4700. Thank you for tuning in to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. Please remember to play responsibly and always look for your man downfield.